So, hello, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of Pathologies of Faith, the intersection of Messianic myth with power. I'm your host, Peter Maravelis, and today's event is being brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with University of California Press and Yale University Press. Our second session is titled Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Has Shaped American Immigration. Joining us will be Professor Yii-Jan Lin. I'd like to acknowledge that our broadcast today is beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It's always an honor and privilege to be able to do so. Professor Yii-Jan Lin is a historian of ideas and biblical texts and the author of The Erotic Life of Manuscripts. She is Associate Professor of New Testament at Yale Divinity School and is a member of the Society of Asian Biblical Studies and European Association of Biblical Studies, and an elected member of Studiorum Novi Testamenti Societas, and I hope I pronounced that all correctly. She is based in New Haven, Connecticut. She's really one of the most innovative scholars working in her field, and we are really greatly honored to have her with us today. Her book associated with today's event is, of course, mirroring the title of the session, Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration. And of course, it is published by Yale University Press. In her talk, Professor Lin will be exploring the conceptualization of America as the Book of Revelation's New Jerusalem, from the time of Columbus to the Puritan colonists, following the U.S. expansion to the eras of the Reagan through Trump administrations. She will illustrate how apocalyptic narratives have been used to exclude unwanted immigrants. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Professor Lin. Welcome to City Lights. It's such an honor to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So Christopher Columbus, he believed that the Christian gospel was to reach, prophesy that all peoples at the ends of the earth needed to be reached, and that the holy city Jerusalem, under the rule of Muslim Mamluk Sultanate, must be conquered for Christendom with a new crusade. So Columbus believed that he himself would bring these prophecies to fruition by his voyages into the West. He would first reach lands where the gospel would spread, and in those lands understood to be the location of the Garden of Eden, of paradise, he would also find gold and treasures enough to fund a new crusade to capture Jerusalem. And when these two things had been accomplished, then God's reign would begin and the New Jerusalem descend. Columbus, in fact, wrote in his notebook collection of prophecies that the book of Revelation showed him that place where he would find paradise across the sea. So from its moment of European discovery, the lands of America were imbued with apocalyptic significance, marking a new era and an apocalyptic one. So the New World became inextricably tied to the ends of the world and to New Jerusalem, God's holy city. And the association with the New Jerusalem marked not only the discovery of the New World, but also of America at the time of colonial settlement of New England. In the 1600s, religious leaders in England who had rejected the Anglican Church led their congregations to establish settlements in New England. And these Puritans, as they were called, wanted to establish holy church communities, towns, and cities in the colonies. Many Puritan leaders believed that they were establishing the New Jerusalem in the New World, either figuratively or even literally. John Davenport, who founded the city of New Haven, which is where I am right now, and Yale University, which is in Connecticut, built the town plan to be like the heavenly city of the New Jerusalem as a 9-square grid, with measurements matching those in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel, which Revelation borrows from. And the place of worship at its center would be where the worship would be where the town green is. So the perception of America as the place for the New Jerusalem, the city of God, is also reflected in the writings of the Puritans, such as Cotton Mather's Theopolis Americana or the American City of God. Mather compares America, and especially New England, to the golden heavenly city of Revelation, and uses this identification to inspire his readers and congregation to live holy lives because they are God's chosen. This kind of thinking, that America is chosen and led by God and should be righteous and an example to the world, is also known as American exceptionalism, and this can be traced through United States history. This American exceptionalism is also full of the apocalyptic thinking we see in Columbus and the Puritans, that is, understanding America as a place of destiny and a holy place, to be described in the glorious terms used in Revelation, and especially as the New Jerusalem. Revelation's dramatic, triumphal, and radiant imagery and metaphors can be found in descriptions of the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War, and in the expansion westward, where the driving out and killing of indigenous peoples is justified because it is America's heavenly and apocalyptic destiny to establish the New Jerusalem on earth. We can trace the influence of Revelation all the way to the 1980s and Ronald Reagan's oft-repeated description of the U.S. as a shining city on a hill, a biblical reference not only from the Gospel of Matthew, but also alluding to Revelation and the identity of America as the New Jerusalem, the shining city that descends from heaven. In fact, in Reagan's speech to the nation in 1989, he describes America, the shining city, as built on strong foundations, humming with commerce and peoples of all kinds, with walls, but with doors that are open for all with the will and the heart to get there. This is a direct allusion to the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21, where the New Jerusalem is depicted as built on 12 foundations, where all the nations and kings of the earth enter bearing tribute, and where there are walls and the gates never shut. And this narrative of America as the New Jerusalem, with walls and gates, but open gates that welcome in all peoples from all nations, is the all-American story of immigration that portrays the U.S. as a glorious, God-chosen destination that is both strongly defended with walls and gates, but it is also welcoming to those, as Reagan says, with the will and the heart to get there. The America described in history by politicians and church leaders, newspapers, and pundits uses Revelation's positive imagery of the New Jerusalem to cast America as a heavenly refuge. But of course, with the book of Revelation, and is the case with most apocalyptic literature, heaven and its glories are not the only story. The apocalyptic text is also full of disaster, violence, judgment, and death. And that's why the popular term apocalyptic means catastrophic, why we have movies called zombie apocalypses or post-apocalyptic, showing the afterlife of world-ending disasters. And this negative and violent side of Revelation is also part of American imagination of immigration. What do I mean by that? I mean that when America, from its discovery to today, is understood and identified as God's city, the New Jerusalem, as a heavenly paradise, using that metaphor also brings with it the dark side of Revelation's story. The New Jerusalem in the Bible does not let everyone in, and the people judged unworthy to enter are thrown into a lake of burning fire. The city has strong defensive walls, and battles are fought with God's enemies. These parts of Revelation's story are also a part of the American vocabulary of immigration. It has been very easy for the same politicians, church leaders, pundits, journalists to portray unwanted immigrant groups as the enemies of God's kingdom, describing them in the same way Revelation describes those outside the walls of the New Jerusalem as outside are the dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Pay attention to this description of those not allowed to emigrate into the New Jerusalem, and you will also find the same strategic descriptions used against immigrant groups throughout American history. People are likened to animals, believed to be religiously bizarre and idolatrous, sexually depraved, violent, and essentially deceptive. And this is the story told throughout U.S. history about Chinese immigrants. And this story has used the images and metaphors from Revelation to exclude them. So for the majority of the rest of this talk, I will weave together the history of Chinese immigration to the U.S. and Revelation's apocalyptic metaphors and descriptions used against Chinese immigrants to exclude and discriminate against them. But again, you will hear very familiar echoes to things that we are witnessing and hearing today and throughout American history. I'm going to begin with a scene from 1870 in the western United States in Tuano, Nevada. Tuano lies in an arid desert landscape dotted with sagebrush. It is now a ghost town with no structure still standing, but in 1870, it was a town connected by the Central Pacific Railroad to the city of Elko, about 75 miles away. January 5th, 1870 was probably a cold day, but railway workers in Toano likely preferred the chill considering the cargo they were loading onto a 6-car train headed west to Elko and on to San Francisco. They had to ensure that each car was packed with the remains of dead Chinese railroad workers, packed as full as possible so the Central Pacific Rail could be well paid for the load. According to the newspaper, the Elko Independent, quote, "We understand that the Chinese companies pay the railroad company $10 for carrying to San Francisco each dead Chinaman. 6 cars well stuffed with this kind of freight will be a good day's work." The paper goes on to state with the same astonishing callousness, "The remains of the females are left to rot in shallow graves, while every defunct male is carefully preserved for shipment to the Occident." The western section of the Transcontinental Railroad had reached completion the prior year, 1869. The remains of the laborers who had died, whether by sickness, in construction accidents, from harsh conditions, or by outright murder, were collected for shipment back to China. Chinese miners had worked in Nevada's silver mines starting in the 1850s, but after the California gold rush, but unlike many other immigrants who had arrived to make their home in the US, they were not accepted as able to become Americans or as citizens. In fact, the same year, the bodies of Chinese railroad workers were shipped from Nevada to San Francisco on July 4th, 1870, Congress voted not to allow Chinese immigrants to naturalize. During the Senate debate that preceded the vote, Senator George Williams, Republican of Oregon, declared that he could not imagine how anyone would want Chinese people to belong to the nation. He said, "Is there anybody who will say that the Chinese is a desirable population? Mongolians, no matter how long they may stay in the United States, will never lose their identity as a peculiar and separate people. They will never amalgamate with persons of European descent." Williams, in that statement, captures succinctly the racialization of Chinese and later Asian peoples as perpetual foreigners throughout their history in the US up to and beyond this talk. And at the end of the 19th century, the Chinese were perceived as the greatest threat by white residents in the Western states. With the end of the gold rush in California, the closing of mines in Nevada, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese laborers moved into other areas of work, and their communities continued to expand. While Chinese immigrants had faced discrimination and harassment since their arrival, the shift of Chinese labor away from the railroads, plus the ongoing arrival of Chinese immigrants in California, prompted still greater violence and hate against them. In anti-Chinese speeches before the Senate, opponents of Chinese immigration dwelled on the hordes of Chinese who were flooding into the U.S., what Senator Thomas Bayard, Democrat of Delaware, called an inundation of countless numbers and of a race wholly different, which could destroy the labor of our own people. The Chinese inundation Bayard speaks of never amounted to more than 1/20th of all immigrants arriving in the U.S. Nevertheless, Chinese peoples were the first racial ethnic group targeted by a nationwide immigration law. The Page Law of 1875 effectively barred Chinese women from entering the United States on the grounds that they were sex workers and morally corrupting. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 further restricted the entry of Chinese immigrants by denying entry to Chinese laborers. While such laws may have calmed fears of an incoming flood of Chinese workers, it did nothing to protect the Chinese already in the U.S. from violent racist hatred. Chinese in America had already experienced violence and expulsion from towns through intimidation and harassment in the 1870s. The brutality reached a climax in the 1880s, during which Chinese were shot, lynched, and tortured not only in California, but in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and other Western territories. In 1885, a group of 150 white men in Wyoming killed at least 28 Chinese coal miners, whom they shot, dismembered, and burned alive. In 1887, a gang of white men tortured, mutilated, and murdered at least 34 Chinese miners in Oregon. No one was ever convicted for this butchery, not in Wyoming or the Oregon massacres, or after murders, lynchings, and mass expulsion from cities in California, Nevada, and Colorado. This hate manifested itself in more legislation in 1884 and 88, which furthered restrictions on Chinese entry, and in the Geary Act of 1892, which required all Chinese laborers and later all Chinese in the U.S. to carry proof that they were in the country legally, thereby implementing the first such federal requirement for documentation. Without a certificate, a Chinese laborer could be forced to do hard labor and be deported, and they could not post bail or testify as witnesses in a trial. The Geary Act was not repealed until 1943, and Chinese entry visas were still then limited to 105 per year total until 1965. In the decades between the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Geary Act of 1904, and ever after, there multiplied depictions of Chinese peoples and China as a looming, dangerous, ugly threat in American political speeches, newspapers, literature, and art. The Chinese had become the yellow peril. As in other moments of American crisis and hate, pundits and politicians have made use of the Book of Revelation to illustrate the situation, flipping the metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem to emphasize the existence of its enemies and the need for violent exclusion. Yellow peril tropes fit easily into the apocalyptic narratives of Revelation. At the foundation of apocalyptic yellow peril imagery and stories used to exclude Chinese from entry and acceptance in the United States lies the belief of a divine and immutable distinction between white Americans and the Chinese quote-unquote race. This belief is at the core speech I quoted from Senator Bayard in 1882 before the passing of the Exclusion Act. Bayard argued that opponents of restrictions on Chinese immigration had only profit and money in mind and did not care about the plight of white Americans. He frames his entire argument in Christian language. He said, "Those who want to import cheap Chinese laborers overlook or disregard the difference of race. They overlook the difference between Chinese and Christian civilization. But," he argues, "a man cannot faithfully serve two contending governments at the same time." Of course, Bayard means the US and China, but in the immediate context, he paraphrases a biblical phrase that serves his purposes exactly. The text comes from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Bayard implies that his fellow congressmen serve either China and greed or the US and God. The Chinese, in Bayard's view, were a race wholly separate and, more importantly, unchristian, unable of belonging to the people of God. Senator Williams argues in that same debate that to welcome in the Chinese was the same as worshiping ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, disease, and prostitution, and sacrificing to these idols the pride and glory of American citizenship. It's no coincidence that Williams names ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, disease, and prostitution as the deities identified with the Chinese and China. These vices have characterized the East and European and American imagination for centuries, and these imagined traits of China and the Chinese play into both their allure and threat in apocalyptic yellow peril discourse. Just as the Chinaman could be both the exploitable coolie and the destroying horde, so also could China be both the source of high-status luxury goods, silk, tea, porcelain, and the decadent and degenerate Babylon of Revelation, the enemy and antithesis of the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. The whore of Babylon, who represents the city of Rome in the ancient context of Revelation, is fleshed out and enrobed in lavish misogynist detail in the biblical text. It reads, "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her prostitution. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of horrors and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus." Here appear all the characterizations of China in the anti-Chinese discourse of the Senate in the 1870s and 80s. Pagan idolatry, decadence, dissipation, greed, sexual corruption and prostitution, impurity and filth, and most threatening of all, the conquering and consumption of Christian peoples, the saints and witnesses of Jesus. While the US senators do not explicitly call China the whore of Babylon, the likening of China to the apocalyptic whore and to the enemies of God's kingdom is clear. And for cartoonists and novelists of the time, the imagery and horror of Revelation provided a vast resource for anti-Chinese illustrations and literature. Puritan Dooner's Last Days of the Republic, published in 1880, possibly the first yellow peril novel published in America, tells a cautionary tale of continued importation of Chinamen for economic profit and the spread of Chinese populations beyond the American West into New England and the South. This infiltration allows Imperial China to invade the United States slowly until the coil of the Asiatic serpent was gradually encircling the entire body of the victim, now virtually within its grasp. And soon Chinese armies march across the nation as they finally make their way to Washington. And the novel concludes, the Republic has fought its last battle, and the Imperial Dragon of China already floated from the dome of the Capitol. In this fear-mongering novel, Babylon China wins, demonstrating the consequences of idolatrous worship of money rather than God. And the final image of the dragon flying over the Capitol is the flag of the Qing dynasty of the time, which features a Chinese long. Whereas in Chinese cultural tradition, the long symbolizes power, blessing, and the emperor, water, and rain, Europeans had, by the 19th century, equated the long with the demonic dragon and serpent of the Bible and Revelation in particular. In Revelation, the dragon first appears in chapter 12, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its heads. And this is the threatening beast ultimately defeated by an army of angels led by the archangel Michael. The war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but were defeated, and there were no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil, and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. This is the draconic Satan that European and American imagination equated with the ancient Long of China and Chinese people. Robert Walter's 1882 novel, A Short and Truthful History of the Taking of California and Oregon by the Chinese in the year AD 1899, goes even further, making explicit use of Satan and the text of Revelation in the novel. Chinese workers spread everywhere and take over the West Coast, led by mysterious Chinese Prince Ca, who sails to San Francisco Bay, inward through the Golden Gate, which is both the Golden Gate Strait in the bay and an allusion to the U.S. identity as a divine and heavenly land. The narrator explicitly states that Prince Ca bore less resemblance to a human being than he did to Milton's Satan. The author ends by warning his readers that China will take over the world, and he quotes from the prophecies of Revelation to identify Prince Ca and the threat from the Orient. The last lines of the novel declare that the Black Dragon has forced the passage of the Golden Gate. This is the same dragon as Satanic China, depicted in political cartoons such as The Dragon's Choice, which appeared on the cover of Harper's Weekly in 1900 at the climax of the conflict between the Boxers and the Euro-American Alliance. The image shows the menacing beast breathing smoke from its mouth, standing over villages on fire, a dragon taking its menacing stand on the seashore as he does in Revelation 12. And of course, facing it is Uncle Sam, who is white-haired, muscular, dressed in sailor whites, adorned with stars aboard a mighty ship. So we have the bestial, raving, dark, satanic China as challenged by the rational, white, and angelic United States. A few years prior to The Dragon's Choice, we have Hermann Nachwuss's Yellow Peril, Die gelbe Gefahr in German, in imagery even more explicitly drawn from Revelation. Nachwuss's illustration was first circulated in Germany and then gained popularity and was printed stateside in Harper's Weekly in 1898. Here we have the Archangel Michael motioning to the threat of the Asian invasion, the Yellow Peril, which is a looming Buddha, flaming Buddha, like the Whore of Babylon, seated on a 7-headed beast from Revelation chapter 12, riding the black storm clouds that form the menacing dragon. And the perspective of the audience is, of course, directed to several European nations represented as white goddesses and women warriors dressed in a mix of nationalist and Greco-Roman symbols, and they stand in the foreground, leading them on the charge is Michael, dressed in typical iconography with rings and Romanesque armor and a flaming sword, about to lead his army into battle with the dragon Satan, as we see in Revelation 12. Besides being the Yellow Peril, the demonic threat taking over the land, Chinese were also labeled as especially diseased and disgusting, a belief that continues to this day in the US as shown by anti-Asian violence and hate during the COVID pandemic. Public discourse linking diseases and plagues with Chinese immigrants also borrowed descriptions and imagery from the Book of Revelation to build up anti-immigration movements. So for example, here's a pest poison advertisement from the 1880s. We have a caricatured Chinaman about to eat a rat. Above them reads the slogan, "They must go," referring to the rats and to the Chinaman. And so text is an allusion to the political slogan, "The Chinese must go," coined by Dennis Kearney and the Working Men's Party of California in 1877. Here we have a common trope for unwanted foreigners. You will recall the charge that Haitian immigrants are eating the cats and eating the dogs. Here we have the Chinese eating what is vile, and to identify Chinese with the rats as a pest themselves, right? That hopefully this poison can work effectively against as well to get rid of them. We also have the Chinaman's queue, a traditional Chinese symbol with a political significance. That's the braid sticking out behind the man's head in an angle that mirrors the tail of the rat he is about to eat. And this is just one of multiple US illustrations portraying the Chinese as a literal pest on the level of rats, mice, bedbugs, flies, and roaches. Here we have a cartoon that ran in 1877 in the San Francisco satirical magazine, The Wasp, a cartoon titled Uncle Sam's Farm in Danger. The cartoon participates in the fear-mongering against Chinese refugees fleeing northern China because of famine in 1876 to 79. Here we have Chinese immigrants featured as a literal pest, a horrifying plague of locusts that are swarming and consuming everything that's in Uncle Sam's farm. And this is also taking and alluding to Revelation 7, the plague of Revelation chapter 9, the plague of locusts, which covers the earth. And like the apocalyptic locusts, the Chinese insects also have, quote, faces like human faces. And their braids are like women's hair as long braids. And they simultaneously represent the tails of scorpions with stingers that stick straight out of their backs like an insect's appendage. We also have, linking this cartoon to the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, the demonic figure of famine driving the grasshoppers on with a cord of whips. And so famine and the grasshoppers appear in shades of pale green, the color of the fourth horse of the apocalypse, which death rides over the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. In 1883, The Wasp ran San Francisco's Three Graces, a cartoon depicting the specter of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy looming over the city of San Francisco, with the Altenauer, a ship that had carried immigrants with smallpox, arriving in harbor. And these giant figures are ghostly and demonic and bestial. They tower above the city, threatening its lone brave church with its crucifix, representative of the pious citizens who must guard against such corrupting invaders. Leprosy was known as the Chinese disease and is a caricatured Chinaman sporting, again, a queue, the braid. And from his left hand flows something white labeled Chinatown. This may be the disease itself poured out on the filthy quarters, echoing the image of the angels who pours plague from the bowl of God's wrath. Or it could also be a flowing cloth, a piece of laundry symbolic of key employment of Chinese immigrants as launderers. So by the date of the Three Graces cartoon in 1883, anti-Chinese politicians had spread this rumor that Chinese workers cleaned and pressed laundry in filthy ways, claiming that they spit water from their mouths on the cloth for ironing, and that this would spread consumption, syphilis, or skin diseases through this mouth spray and the filthiness of their work areas. And articles identified Chinese laundries as opium dens and implied that they corrupt whites of both sexes who are, quote, frequenters of the places by day and night. So for Chinese living in the US, their identification by white society as diseased, pestilent, corrupting meant the constant surveilling and policing of their homes and businesses, accompanied by threat of invasive fumigation, unsafe quarantine, and isolation. Health inspections also were set up once the detention center in Angel Island was built, in which Chinese were forced to have invasive procedures that were never routine on Ellis Island, to inspect them. So the island's health inspectors would separate Asian men and women, make them strip naked, demand fecal samples for bacteriological scrutiny. And the focus on parasites, undetectable except through microscopic examination, stoked fears that Chinese and other Asians might appear healthy while passing on invisible parasites once entering America. The Chinese body, the Asian body, and all unwanted bodies that had to be kept from entering the U.S. were identified not only as carriers of parasites, but also indistinguishable from pests and disease. In describing the filthy quarters of San Francisco's Chinatown as likely to harbor cholera, News writers identified the neighborhood as a place of stagnant water and dirty clothing and filthy bodies. And these three elements, impure water, dirty clothes, filthy bodies, are continuously emphasized in the American public discourse that associates unwanted immigrants with plague and disease. They are also the key characteristics of the damned and their destruction in the book of Revelation, in which waters turn to poison and blood, idolaters do not wash their robes or live in shameful nakedness or dress in degenerate scarlet and purple, and the sinful suffer from painful sores or degrade their bodies with fornication. The New Jerusalem of Revelation and its citizens present the opposite characteristics. The city flows with pristine river of water of life, from which the blessed may drink, and the holy citizens of the New Jerusalem, angels of God and the Son of Man, wear clean washed white robes, and their bodies are pure of sexual corruption and are holy and healed by the fruit of the tree of life growing along the river. That American anti-immigrant discourse should use the same elements as Revelation, both to describe itself as pristine and the unwanted as filthy, is not just coincidence. The long and persistent use of the New Jerusalem to imagine America had incorporated into immigration discourse the vocabulary of purity, filth, health, and disease in distinctly Christian modes. This is especially apparent when analyzing mission stories of Chinese conversion to Christianity, in which individuals become qualified for inclusion in America. This transition occurs through personal and individual conversion to Protestant Christianity that go hand in hand with markers of cleanliness like those of Revelation. So, for example, one San Francisco church publication from 1900, a white missionary visits a Chinese woman who is taken from Chinatown during a raid on lodgings deemed a brothel. And the Chinese woman converts to Christianity and is moved into a house described as full of God's love, pure air, and sunshine. Her curtains are a snowy white. And during the visit, she is doing laundry. She's washing her robes like they do in Revelation 22. Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates. So for Chinese immigrants wanting to enter the gates of America, the country could be seen as a heavenly destination. We have the reminiscences of Yii-Jan, who entered the San Francisco Strait in 1868, and he had set sail from Guangdong. And he wrote later in his memoirs, to be actually at the Golden Gate of the land of our dreams, that feeling that welled up in us was indescribable. I wonder whether the ecstasy before the pearly gates of the celestial city could surpass what we felt at that moment when we realized we had reached our destination. But after the initial hope and excitement of seeing the shores of the celestial city, Jane encountered the violent and fearful reality faced by Chinese immigrants into the 1870s and 80s. The useful and steady Chinese worker, he recalls, became overnight the mysterious Chinaman, an object of unknown dread. And instead of entering the heavenly city, the Chinese were not allowed in, but abandoned to the flames, like the fate of anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life, and so was thrown into the lake of fire. Jean's recollections of the terrible persecution of Chinese is laced with flames. There were long processions, he writes, with big torch lights and lanterns carrying the slogan, "The Chinese must go," and mass meetings where fiery tongues flayed the Chinese bogey. We also have from Angel Island the testimony of those who were detained in the men's barracks. The Chinese men detained there carved poetry into the barracks where they lived. They were surrounded by heavenly names, Angel Island, Golden Gate, Golden State, Gold Mountain, but they knew it was not for them. One of the poems reads, not the one shown here, but another one, "This place is called an island of immortals, when in fact this mountain wilderness is a prison." A Chinese woman wrote a letter about her detention saying, "We were to go to the immigration station, Angel Island. Unfortunately, we were not able to find any angels there, but we did see many heartless human beings." The rejection, interrogation, inspection, and humiliation of those seeking entry to America stands in sharp contrast to the promise of paradise and Reagan's open doors for those with the will and the heart to enter. This does not mean, however, that America failed as the New Jerusalem, but rather that the metaphor continued and continues today to serve the political interests of those who use it in immigration discourse. America as the New Jerusalem, with its gleaming walls and foundations set on a shining city on a hill, presents a fresh beginning, moral aspirations, promises of wealth, and promises of safety and stability. But implicit in the purity of those within the city walls is the exclusion of the impure without, the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters that is told of in Revelation 22. That is the language the American government is still using against immigrants today, speaking of invasions by enemies, likening immigrants to animals, describing them as godless and violent in order to justify their deportation and extermination. In this moment of authoritarian government by executive order, especially with the support of Christian nationalists intent on Christian dominion, the extreme language of apocalypse is once again at work in America. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, and thank you so very much for that. We're going to open it up now for Q&A, but I was really struck by the extent and just the sheer volume of apocalyptic fiction of the last 2 centuries. And what's also really crazy is how it's sort of still with us. I mean, when you think about people like Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins, and then there's like Terry James Wesley Rawls. I mean, there is this genre which lives to this day and which really follows kind of in the footsteps of the fiction you mentioned earlier. Let's see if anyone has dropped anything else in the chat. When you were researching, some of this genre, I mean, where did your research take you, and how did you unearth some of this?
I mean, a lot of it is actually just serendipitous. I think many researchers don't want to say that, but I think it's true. You start pulling on a thread and then you find very randomly, right, associated political cartoons, even just a simple Google search that will take you down a rabbit trail of newspaper clippings. And it's great that you have, historic newspaper databases now you can search in images. Hopefully we can keep those archives forever. But yeah, a lot of looking through presidential speeches and congressional debates was a big part of that as well. So those were the main archives that I accessed in order to find some of this stuff. It's just interesting to see how much, not just Revelation, but so many texts from the Bible are used to justify, that are alluded to or referenced in political debates within our government. So definitely, we speak of church and state as separate, but I mean, we already see that is not the case, perhaps de jure, but not de facto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So everyone, please do post your questions and comments in the chat. We still have a few minutes and we can take some before we begin our next session. Anyone? Takes a few seconds usually for people to put their thoughts together. Let me see if there's anything coming through. There we go. Pastor comments, were there significant or impactful counter narratives that reference scriptures that you came upon while pulling on these dominant threads?
So I think the emphasis on those who are for immigration would be using, particularly in the last 20 years, in Christian discourse, particularly Protestant discourse on immigration, would be passages from the Gospels. And I think some of you might be familiar with these, but many referencing scripture to talk about Jesus himself as a refugee, at least told in the birth narratives of Matthew and in Luke, and to reference the Gospels in particular over and against Revelation. So it's interesting to see. We do have, disagreements, I think, beside in the major themes that we find in different books of the Christian canon that are being used in very different ways. But I don't think they're referenced as much explicitly as they are in the last 20, 30 years in thinking about immigration. But I would say the Gospels for sure.
Yeah. Well, I would like to thank you, Professor Lin, for gracing our halls. You've given us such a great deal to think about. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. We will be taking a short break now. Our next session will be at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. It's called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. We'll be joined by Jonathan Rauch. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. We hope to see you all again very shortly. Take care.